She looked innocent, but Betty Boop was never meant to be harmless. In 1930, this animated flapper shocked audiences with jazz, attitude, and rules she refused to follow. Then censorship stepped in. Scenes vanished. Designs changed. Her voice was softened. What was removed from her cartoons says more about the era than the character, and that's where the real story begins for animation history forever. Fact 1. Betty was originally a cartoon dog before becoming human. Betty Boop did not start as the character people recognize today, and that truth was quietly hidden for years. When she first appeared in 1930 in the Talkertoons animated series, Betty was not fully human at all. She was designed as a cartoon dog with floppy ears, inspired by animal characters common at Fleischer Studios. Animator Grim Natwick, working under creator Max Fleischer, slowly reshaped her look over several episodes. The floppy ears were shortened, then transformed into hoop earrings. Her snout softened into a small human nose. By 1932, Betty had become completely human, with a round face, oversized eyes, and a baby-like head, designed to enhance expressive animation. This evolution was intentional. Fleischer believed exaggerated features made emotional movement clearer on screen. At the time, no announcement explained the change, and audiences simply accepted it. Later, studios avoided mentioning her animal origins, likely to protect her new image. That early transformation quietly exposed how flexible cartoon identity was in the early animation era. But that visual freedom soon faced limits no animator expected. Fact 2. The jazz voice that sparked a lawsuit. Betty Boop's personality did not come from nowhere. It was deeply tied to the jazz age and to a real singing style audiences already knew. In the late 1920s, popular singer Helen Kane was famous for her baby voice, flirtatious delivery, and the phrase boop-boop-a-doop. When Betty appeared using a similar sound, comparisons exploded. In 1932, Kane filed a lawsuit against Fleischer Studios, claiming Betty was an animated copy of her public image. The case became one of the earliest legal battles over cartoon identity. During the trial, Max Fleischer's team presented evidence that Kane herself had borrowed the style from earlier black jazz performers, including singer Esther Jones, known as Baby Esther. Witnesses testified that the vocal style was already part of vaudeville culture. The court ruled in favor of Fleischer Studios, allowing Betty to continue unchanged. Still, the controversy followed her forever. Studios later downplayed the connection to avoid attention. What began as a celebration of jazz culture had suddenly become a legal warning for animation creators across the entire animation industry world. Fact 3. Animation's first female sex symbol. Betty Boop crossed a line no animated character had crossed before, and audiences noticed immediately. By 1931, she was openly promoted as a grown, flirtatious cartoon woman, not a childlike figure. Animation historian Leonard Maltin later confirmed Betty is widely considered the first fully animated female sex symbol. Her short dress revealed a visible garter, her movements were guided by jazz rhythm, and her poses were deliberately suggestive for the time. These choices came directly from Max Fleischer's belief that animation could reflect adult culture, not just slapstick humor. Betty winked at the camera, bent her knees, and moved her hips in ways borrowed from live jazz performances. The Fleischer animation team used rotoscoping and musical timing to make her movements feel natural and human. Theater audiences reacted strongly, especially adults attending late screenings, but moral groups began complaining that her cartoons were inappropriate. While no scenes were officially banned yet, internal studio notes show growing pressure from distributors. Betty's popularity was soaring, but so was discomfort around her image. That tension set the stage for forces that would soon reshape her entire animated identity. Fact 4. The censorship code that changed everything. Everything changed for Betty Boop in 1934 when Hollywood censorship stopped being optional. That year, the Motion Picture Production Code, commonly called the Hays Code, began strict enforcement across all studios, including animation. The code was overseen by Joseph Breen, who believed cartoons should follow the same moral rules as feature films. Betty instantly became a target. Her short dresses, garter belt, hip movements, and flirty behavior were all flagged as unacceptable. Fleischer Studios received direct instructions demanding changes. Scenes with suggestive dancing were cut. Camera angles were adjusted to hide her body. Dialogue was rewritten to remove double meanings. Even background visuals were monitored for improper jokes. According to animation historians, this was one of the first times a cartoon character was altered by moral law rather than creative choice. Max Fleischer publicly disagreed, but had little power to resist if he wanted his cartoons distributed. Betty's free-spirited personality was slowly restrained. frame by frame. The character audiences love still existed, but under heavy limits. And once censorship entered her world, it never truly left again. Fact 5. Betty Boop was visually rewritten by censors. After censorship took control, Betty Boop's appearance was no longer decided by animators alone. Starting in 1934, Fleischer Studios was required to redesign her to meet moral guidelines. Her iconic strapless dress was replaced with higher necklines and longer skirts. The visible garter, once a defining detail, disappeared entirely. Her body proportions were adjusted to reduce curves, and her movements became more restrained. Animation model sheets from the period show clear differences before and after enforcement. Max Fleischer later admitted in interviews that these changes were forced, not artistic. To soften her image further, the studio added wholesome supporting characters like Pudgy the puppy, designed to appeal to children. Betty's facial expressions also changed. Winks, bedroom eyes, and slow blinks were discouraged. Instead, she smiled brightly and behaved more politely. These visual restrictions made her safer for theaters, but stripped away much of what made her unique. Audiences noticed the shift almost immediately. The character still carried her name, but her visual identity had been carefully rewritten. And this transformation would soon affect more than just how she looked on screen. Fact 6. Her audience was quietly replaced. Before censorship, Betty Boop cartoons were created mainly for adults. In the early 1930s, animated shorts played before feature films, and those films were aimed at grown audiences. Betty's humor, music, and attitude matched that crowd. After 1934, everything shifted. Under the Hays Code, Fleischer Studios was pushed to make her cartoons suitable for children. Storylines became simpler. Musical numbers turned playful instead of sultry. Danger and mystery were reduced. According to animation scholars, this change caused a silent audience swap. Adults stopped feeling represented, while children were never fully drawn to Betty in the first place. To fill the gap, studios leaned into safer themes like pets, chores, and gentle comedy. Betty became a responsible figure instead of a rebellious one. Theater attendance data from the late 1930s shows declining interest in her shorts compared to earlier years. No public announcement explained the change. Viewers just felt something was missing. Betty had not disappeared, but the audience that once loved her was quietly gone, and that loss would soon take a visible toll on her animated career. Fact 7. The slow decline no one publicly admitted. Betty Boop's fall was gradual, not sudden, which made it easier to ignore. Her cartoon series officially ran from 1930 to 1939, but animation historians agree her creative peak ended much earlier. After censorship reshaped her character, Fleischer Studios struggled to keep her relevant. New episodes relied heavily on side characters, especially Pudgy the puppy, who often drove the plot. Betty herself became reactive instead of leading the action. Studio records and interviews suggest the creative team knew the magic was fading, but had limited options. They could not restore her original edge without violating the production code. Meanwhile, competing studios were producing faster, louder, and more visually aggressive cartoons. Theater owners began choosing other shorts over Betty's. By the late 1930s, her animations felt outdated. There was no scandal, no official cancellation announcement, just a quiet end. In 1939, production stopped. Betty vanished from theaters, not because audiences rejected her entirely, but because the version allowed to exist no longer felt alive. Yet even in silence, her influence continued to grow in unexpected places. Fact 8. Real jazz legends were animated into her world. Betty Boop cartoons were deeply connected to real music, and that connection was revolutionary for animation. In the early 1930s, Max Fleischer believed cartoons should feel alive, so he invited real jazz performers into Betty's animated universe. One of the most famous was Cab Calloway, whose dance moves were rotoscoped to create characters like Coco the Clown and ghostly figures that danced beside Betty. Calloway's actual performances were filmed, then traced frame by frame to capture real rhythm and motion. Other musicians, including Rudy Vallee and Ethel Merman, also appeared through animated interpretations of their voices and songs. This was not parody, it was collaboration. These cartoons preserved real jazz culture at a time when few films did. However, after censorship tightened, these musical sequences became safer and less expressive. The wild, surreal energy faded. Still, these shorts remain historic because they captured real performers inside animation. Betty became a bridge between jazz clubs and cartoon screens. But this bold musical freedom also drew attention from censors, who were watching closely and preparing to restrict even that creative space. Fact 9. The Snow White cartoon. Disney didn't want compared. In 1933, Betty Boop starred in an animated short titled Snow White, produced by Max Fleischer and directed by Dave Fleischer, years before Disney released its famous feature. This version was darker, stranger, and far more surreal than anything audiences expected. Betty was not the princess herself, but the emotional center of the story, trapped in a nightmarish world of shifting shadows and transforming shapes. The animation relied heavily on rotoscoping, using real filmed movements movement to create ghostly dances and impossible motion. Jazz legend Cab Calloway provided music and movement inspiration, giving the cartoon an eerie rhythm that felt alive. Animation historians often note that Disney closely monitored Fleischer releases during this period. While there is no official statement confirming rivalry influence, the timing raised eyebrows inside the industry. Fleischer's Snow White pushed visual experimentation far beyond safe storytelling. After censorship tightened, this kind of surreal darkness nearly vanished from Betty's cartoons. The short later gained recognition as a landmark in animation history, and its bold creativity made censors even more uneasy about where animation could go next. Fact 10. The voices that shaped Betty's identity. Betty Boop's personality depended heavily on the voices behind her, and those choices were carefully made. The most famous voice came from Mae Questel, who defined Betty's high-pitched tone during her peak years. Questel was already an experienced performer and also voiced Olive Oyl in the Popeye animated series, also produced by Fleischer Studios. Earlier, Betty's shorts used voices from Margie Hines and Bonnie Poe, each adding subtle differences in rhythm and emotion. In the early 1930s, voice recording was done live in studio sessions with little chance for correction. This meant performances had to feel natural and expressive in a single take. Mae Questel later explained in interviews that Betty's voice was meant to sound playful but confident, not childish. After censorship enforcement, even vocal delivery was adjusted. Lines were softened, flirtation was reduced, and emotional range narrowed. The voice stayed recognizable, but its freedom faded. These behind-the-scenes changes shaped how audiences perceived Betty without ever being announced, and soon pressure around her voice would connect to larger cultural controversy. Fact 11. Why moral groups targeted a cartoon character. Betty Boop became a symbol in a cultural battle that went far beyond animation. In the early 1930s, moral reform groups closely monitored theater content, including cartoons. Because Betty's shorts played before adult films, critics argued she influenced public behavior, not just children. Religious and civic organizations sent complaints to distributors, claiming her cartoons encouraged improper behavior. According to film historians, these complaints were often vague but persistent. They focused on her independence, flirtation, and refusal to act submissive. This made Betty unusual for female characters of the era. While no single group officially banned her, the pressure helped justify stricter enforcement of the production code. Fleischer Studios received warnings suggesting Betty should become more domestic and respectable. Soon after, storylines placed her in household roles or as a caretaker. This was not coincidence. It reflected social expectations of women during the period. Betty's censorship was not just about clothing or movement. It was about controlling a female animated character who refused to fit traditional roles. And that cultural discomfort would echo through animation for decades. Fact 12. How Betty survived without new cartoons. Even after Betty Boop disappeared from theaters in 1939, she never truly vanished. Her image lived on through merchandise long after new animation stopped. Fleischer Studios had licensed Betty for products as early as the 1930s, including dolls, postcards, and sheet music. Decades later, these designs were rediscovered by collectors and pop culture fans. In the 1970s, television syndication brought her original cartoons back to public attention, introducing her to a new generation. This revival focused heavily on her pre-censorship image, which audiences found more striking and expressive. Fashion brands, posters, and collectibles adopted her flapper look as a symbol of rebellion and nostalgia. Legal ownership later passed through different companies, but her visual identity remained protected and recognizable. Unlike many early animated characters, Betty became more famous after her original run ended. Her survival proved that a strong animated design could outlive censorship and time itself. And as her image spread again, historians began re-examining the parts of her story that were once hidden. Fact 13. The precedent that changed female animation forever. Betty Boop's censorship left a lasting mark on how animated women were created afterward. Animation historians widely agree that her transformation became a warning example inside studios. After the mid-1930s, female cartoon characters were designed to appear safer, quieter, and less independent. Studios avoided flirtation, exaggerated curves, and adult themes, especially for female leads. This shift was not accidental. Producers feared censorship penalties and distribution problems. As a result, many animated women became supporting figures rather than central stars. When they did appear, they often filled domestic or comic roles instead of driving stories. Scholars point out that this pattern continued through the 1940s and 1950s. Betty's case proved that even massive popularity could not protect a character from moral control. Her original freedom was seen as a risk studios were unwilling to repeat. It took decades for animation to slowly reintroduce complex female characters. Today, Betty is often referenced in academic discussions as the moment when creative expression collided with social fear, and her influence quietly shaped animation long after her voice left the screen. Fact 14. Why the original Betty is celebrated again today. Modern audiences rarely meet the censored version of Betty Boop first. Instead, they are drawn to her earliest cartoons where her personality feels bold and alive. Film archives, museums, and animation historians actively promote her pre-1934 shorts as examples of creative freedom. In recent years, restored prints have been screened at festivals, allowing viewers to see the original animation quality and expressive movement. Broadway productions and exhibitions have also highlighted Betty as a symbol of early female independence in animation. Scholars often credit Max Fleischer's artistic philosophy for giving her such lasting power. He believed cartoons should reflect real culture, not hide from it. Unlike many characters from her era, Betty's appeal has grown stronger with historical distance. What once made censors uncomfortable now feels honest and groundbreaking. Her return to prominence is not nostalgia alone, it is recognition. Betty Boop's original form represents a moment when animation dared to challenge social rules, and that daring spirit is exactly why her story still matters today. Betty Boop's journey reveals how animation once pushed boundaries, then paid the price for it. Created by Max Fleischer as a reflection of real culture, she was reshaped by fear, rules, and control. What was censored did not disappear, it waited. Today, her original spirit reminds us that creativity never truly dies, even when it's forced into silence.